Let's look at one of the best product lines that I've found for training swordsmanship and HEMA really safely, really quickly, and a really fun way. That's right folks, we're going to be looking at some of FakeSteel Armory's amazing products, which I have to fully endorse. More details coming up in this video. But before we look at FakeSteel's amazing products, just to mention that this of course is not supposed to replace steel weapons. Steel weapons will always be the principal weapons used in HEMA, and you know, I started my fencing career with modern Olympic fencing. Here's an épée, which I currently use now. However, I started out with foil, then saber, then épée, so I did that before I moved into HEMA. And in HEMA, yes, we've got lots of other materials for training weapons as well. We don't only use steel. There are leather dusaks, there's obviously synthetic or plastic training swords, and traditionally speaking, there's single sticks and wasters, so wooden weapons, and in some cases leather weapons and possibly even padded weapons were absolutely a thing historically, not just today. And you get something from training with those weapons as a club that you can't necessarily get with steel. Now obviously HEMA takes many different forms, as do other sword-based martial arts in the world, and we use many different training weapons according to how we are training. If we're doing armoured fighting, then very often we actually use wooden or sometimes synthetic heads or blades in order to basically practice stabbing into gaps more safely, which is actually quite difficult to do with steel weapons. But even if we do use steel weapons, they have to have safe blunt tips on them, and if we're doing half swording, for example, we have to have safety tips on the end of our swords. And one of our main concerns with standard HEMA, that is Blossfechten or unarmoured fencing, is that the barrier to entry for sparring or fencing, free play, whatever you want to call it, is actually quite high because you need a lot of equipment. Obviously you need a fencing mask, you need certain types of gloves, big debates around what gloves are the best for different weapons. Very often you need different gloves for different weapons because they don't all work for all weapons. Then you need a jacket, you need leg guards, you need a groin guard. If you're a woman, you need a chest guard, all of these extra things. So there's a lot of gear to be able to fence with steel weapons. So there is absolutely, definitely a place in the world for safer, or should we say less dangerous, training weapons in the HEMA environment, either to get people fencing sooner or simply because you want to have some free play time that you can do without having to carry, transport or wear all of that gear. You might be in a very hot country, you might be traveling, you might be going down to the park for a picnic. There are many situations where you might want to use a dusak, a single stick, or what we're going to look at here. So FakeSteel Armory swords, I've been using these, or rather we've been using these in the club for a few months now, and they are, spoiler alert, fantastic. We absolutely love them. They are universally loved in the club. Now, they are loved by both the beginners who we want to get introduced to sparring, but they don't have, you know, they don't want to move into steel yet, and they don't want to, you know, necessarily have all the gear yet, but we can get them sparring with merely a fencing mask. And I have to say, even just with some goggles, you don't necessarily need a fencing mask. However, we do like to at least teach people how to defend against thrusts to the face and stuff like that. So fencing mask, good idea. But purely with a fencing mask and a cup, I would recommend, you can get sparring pretty much like full out with these. So these are brilliant to introduce people to fencing. But in addition to that, they are also brilliant for melee games, and they're actually really, really good simulators, one-on-one or in small groups, between experienced fencers. And I, as you know, I've been doing HEMA since 1997, how many years that is now, a lot. 28 years, God. And other people in my club, some of them have been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years as well. And we also love sparring with these. They're just really, really good fun. And I have to say, on a personal level, it's incredibly liberating to be able to pick up one of these and either start, you know, training a beginner or going with one of the experienced guys and doing all of the stuff that we do without having to put all of the gear on. It's hot, it's sweaty, it's cumbersome. It's really, really nice just putting a mask on. You don't necessarily even need gloves, although I do tend to put leather gloves on. So just a pair of leather gloves, gardening gloves, cycling gloves, whatever, and a fencing mask, and you can go at it with these. Now, I should point out there are different options on the FakeSteel Armory website, and this is the HEMA option. So I believe that this is slightly denser material, and I think they're slightly stiffer and slightly heavier. They do have, I believe, metal inside the hilt for weighting, so these aren't as light or as soft as your typical LARP sword. These are not simply LARP swords. These are kind of LARP swords on steroids. So they're what are colloquially known in HEMA circles as boffers. And there are other companies making boffers, and not to, you know, badmouth any of those or anything like this, but these are by far our favourite for a number of reasons. Firstly, the blades are more blade-like. They have a flex that's similar to steel. They also have good kind of geometry and shape, cross-sectional shape. So it's far more like a blade. When you bind, they actually bind pretty damned well. They're not too slippery. In fact, they're less slippery than a typical kind of Rawlings synthetic. Kind of similar to steel. They don't bounce too much either. They don't bounce off each other. So when you parry, the blade tends to stay there. So they're not as bouncy as some things. But moreover, the hilts are basically like the hilts of real swords. We're going to look at some different models here in a second. But the crossguards, they do have some give to them, but they are stiff enough to stop blows. Okay, so they don't bend out of the way like some LARP swords do that are just kind of really soft foam. They have some rigidity to them while still remaining safe, but they're also really slim. Look at the shape of that. It looks like a real sword. The pommel is the size of a real sword. The grip is the right shape. It's oval. You can index the edge. It feels, when you're holding it in the air, it feels pretty similar to a steel sword. So let's go quickly through the models of different weapons. They're not all swords actually that we've got here. So first of all, we've got a pair of long swords. They're sort of matched in terms of size and weight, but you'll notice they've got slightly different, they've got different colour grips where they've got different style crossguards. There are different options, there's different blade options, the different, as I say, there's different foam density and different stiffness, I believe, and weight possibly. So there is a HEMA version and there's a LARP version. So they do make LARP weapons, but they also make sort of HEMA-centric versions. And these are the HEMA ones. These are a really good pair. These work very well against each other. And these have been used probably more than any of the other swords in the club. And they have stood up really, really well. Now, bearing in mind that these are hitting fencing masks quite a lot. And the tips, you have to be a little bit more careful with the thrusts. I have told my students to be anyway, but there has been no damage whatsoever to the tips, which are quite cleverly constructed inside to make them more durable, so you can thrust with these safely. They hit with a fair amount of authority, okay, so you don't want to necessarily wind up and smash someone around the head if they're a beginner. In fact, I would recommend you don't do that. But so, you know, they hit with a fair amount of force, but they don't really hurt because of the way that the foam is constructed. So we've just found that, you know, just in t-shirts with a mask and gloves is perfectly fine. You can fight pretty full on with these. And they're brilliant. They're really durable. They've got absolutely no signs of damage on them whatsoever. There's no really scuffs, scrapes, there's no tears, anything like that. And these have been hitting obviously mostly bodies, but also fencing masks. So in addition to those, we also got, to stick with the same period, there is an arming sword. Now, I have to say, this arming sword is not ideal for me. I'd prefer it was a bit longer. So it was a bit on the short side, shorter than I was expecting. And one little detail of this particular grip is I found that with gloves on, it doesn't feel too bad in bare hands, but with gloves, it has a tendency of turning in the grip. So while I love the look of this one, and other people in the club actually like this, personally, just for me, okay, I find that the grip is a little bit too skinny and a little bit too cylindrical. So I find that turns the grip. But in terms of the product, it stood up brilliantly, really, really tough. Again, no damage whatsoever, and that's been used for weeks and weeks and weeks by numerous people in the club. Now on this product, at this point, I'll just point out that FakeSteel also do really good scabbards, and they provided us with a few here. And you'll see that obviously the scabbard has to be wide enough to fit the kind of fatter profile of the blade compared to a steel blade, but real brass fittings, real brass here, real leather belt, a really good buckle, better than some reenactment buckles I've seen, with a, you know, Sun in Splendour decorated leather belt. This is really, really swish. It looks really good. So kind of in a, whether it's a LARP or living history kind of a thing, you know, it works, it looks good, it looks the part from a distance. Obviously it's fatter than the real thing, but when it's against your side you don't necessarily see that. So it works really, really well, and we've got different scabbards. We've got 3 scabbards for 3 of these swords. So next up is this Mamluk Shamshir, should we call it? Kilich. It's somewhere between a, yeah, it's kind of like between one and the other essentially. But it's essentially, it's a sort of Ottoman Turkish style saber, if you want to call it that, curved sword, Kilich or Shamshir. Now this, I absolutely love the look of, and I love how it handles. Also the scabbard for it is really, really cool there, all with leather and brass, looks really the part. The only thing I would say is, personally, given that I put a pair of gloves on usually for using these, I have found that grip a little bit short for my hand, or rather this angle here I found digs into my little finger a bit. Now it has to be said, I mentioned this to other people in the club and they don't have the same issue. So again, this is a personal thing to me. I find I tend not to use this sword because that I find makes my little finger sore. Having said that, I have used it quite a lot. That's why I've discovered it makes my little finger sore. I just feel that that angle needs revising slightly there. It's a little bit too tight in there. But otherwise, it's a really, really nice sword. It moves really, really well. It moves very similar actually to most training dusak. And we found that this and one of the other swords we're going to look at in a second, basically when you use them, you basically fight in the style of Langmesser, dusak. They work brilliantly for that. And this is that other sword just mentioned that we tend to use against that one. It's got a knuckle bow. It's essentially, it's a Wakefield hanger. And again, you'll see it's got a scabbard, leather covered scabbard with historically correct 15th century knot. I mean, this is better than some steel swords come with. And this is a straight blade, but actually is quite similar to the Shamshir we just looked at. I have to say I prefer this one to use because it's got a slightly longer grip and it's a bit more comfortable on my hand. Moreover, it's long enough and rectangular enough that you can actually use it with a thumb up grip as well there. And it's got a knuckle bow, gives a bit of extra protection. One thing I'll note as well is these guards have some flex to them, but they're quite stiff. So they're brilliant. I mean, this is, if I was designing a product, this is what I would aim for, you know, a bit of give in it to make it safe, but fundamentally quite stiff and really realistically sized. It's not fatter, it's not bigger particularly than the real thing. And in terms of stiffness, ow, it hurts a bit if you really whack yourself hard. So it's similar to the training dusaks I've seen over the years, but it looks more like a real sword, and we've got lots of different designs here, which is really cool, really fun. Again, absolutely no damage to the tip or the blade. This particular sword is very popular in the club, I have to say. This has been used a lot against lots of the other weapons, both in melees and one-on-one. Popular with beginners, popular with the experienced people as well. So this is a really good analogue for people who would maybe doing Langmesser or dusak. Okay, for Langmesser it maybe doesn't have a long enough hilt, but for dusak type fighting, or even for as a short back sword, you know, as a hanger, or indeed a saber, an infantry saber, works pretty damn well. So you can use this in a sort of 16th century style, or you could almost use this in a 19th century style. Very, very versatile sword, this one. And it really, again, it binds well, it's got good stiffness, it's got a good heft to it, it moves at about the correct speed for a steel sword, it's weightier than a single stick, and it has proper edge cross section. Right, as I mentioned, we didn't only get swords, we also got a warhammer and an axe, and these are huge fun. And you know, they're types of weapons, these kind of percussive top heavy weapons. Usually we don't train very much in HEMA because there's no real safe alternative for these sorts of weapons in HEMA until now. And now what I will say is these weapons are, unlike the swords, which are not, they kind of move at the same speed, although they are technically lighter than the real steel weapons. They sort of move at the same speed as steel weapons. These are a little bit quicker than the real thing. It depends what real thing you're talking about. This probably moves at about the same speed as a real tomahawk. This does move quicker. I've actually got, as you know, the wall hammer, quite a comparable, similar warhammer there. And this, it's got some authority to it, more than the swords, and it does feel like more of a top heavy weapon than the swords. But for obvious reasons, you can't make it as heavy. You can't make it move in exactly the same way as a real warhammer because you'd literally be knocking people out through their fencing masks. That said, they're really good training alternatives and super fun. I can't emphasize that word enough. These are super fun to use. And one of the things that's interesting about these is you instantly start to you're able to do hooking things with these weapons that you can't do with swords. So you can do some of the techniques that are unique to these sorts of weapons that we can't normally do in HEMA. So it's really fun to use. What I would say is that the Warhammer, because it's got shorter projections, these are all a bit stiffer. So although they're shorter and it's harder to hook with them, when you do hook, you have a little bit more leverage. With the axe, conversely, it's easier to hook because you've got a bigger beard here, for the bearded axe, but this is more flexible and softer. So often what we've found is you can block with the top incidentally, which is something you find in poleaxe techniques. So if something's swinging down at you here, you can block with the end there quite successfully. But what we have found is when deliberately going to hook someone's blade, for example, often you do hook it, but then it comes out because this beard flexes. So I just wonder if this should have some sort of maybe stiffener around the bottom here. It wouldn't need to affect the edge that you're hitting with, but if there was some kind of almost plastic hook type construction inside here, just to make it a little bit better for hooking. It's just an idea, just a suggestion. Right, the last two swords, and again, all of these have stood up fantastically well. No damage, no tears to the outer surface, no problems with the tips, nothing at all. These have all been very durable. Last two weapons, the opposite ends of the timescale. So on one hand we have the 1796 light cavalry saber. This is one of the most popular weapons. If someone says, do you want to have a go with the Boffers or the FakeSteel Armory swords, then people often rush to the 1796. It handles really nicely. The grip's got a lovely shape. I mean, it looks like the real thing. It's got good knuckle protection compared to the medieval swords. Yeah, it just kind of moves and handles really nicely. And I've got to say, it handles really similarly to the real thing. And at the other end of the time spectrum, this is actually one of my favourites, probably my favourite sword out of the whole bunch. This is a Viking era sword. Now, obviously I own Viking era swords, but I don't spar with them because I don't have any sparring ones. So this was really fun for me to play with because it's got a correct size and shape Viking era hilt of the 8th or 9th century. And I actually really love this because the shape of pommel, you can really experience that flicking that blade out, but retaining it with your little finger against that pommel there. See, this is a brilliant trainer. You could use it with shields. I actually haven't used this with shields. Trying to think if we use it with a buckler. I don't think we have yet. I've just used this as a single sword, and obviously it's got virtually no hand protection, so you've got to be very wary. You're mostly doing deflects and beats rather than, you know, parries like you would do with a saber, because you've got no hand protection. But I love the way it handles and I love the way it looks. Really cool. And I think from a distance or on a movie screen, most people would assume that that was a real steel Viking era sword. Anyway, so overall, to conclude, we have used these tons over the last couple of months. They are universally popular in the club. They're popular with beginners because it means that at the end of the normal formal class, they can have some fun with minimum gear. They are popular with the experienced people because they're fun and actually pretty good sparring tools. You know, they're not perfect. They're never going to be steel weapons, but for what they are, to be honest, I much prefer sparring with these than with the standard synthetic, you know, nylon swords that we actually use in class for drilling. I much prefer sparring with these because you can take all the gear off, you can just stick a mask on and some gloves and a box and off you go. And I have to say, one of the other great advantages of these, they're great for beginners, they're fun for more experienced people, they're very good for melee games, they're a much safer alternative for melee games and, you know, massed combat. But one of the things I love the most about these is they are not legally or technically a sword. And as you well know, I live in the crazy nation known as the United Kingdom, which has some insane and very strict weapon laws. And I know that we could go down to the local park or onto the local common with these, and there's no trouble we could get into. Nobody could, someone might, you know, go, oh my God, they've got swords. And you go, no, they're made of whatever, they're made of foam. They're not real ones. And the ability to transport and use these anywhere in this crazy country called the UK is very liberating, because we have to be very careful how we transport our steel swords and where we use them and stuff like this these days, unfortunately. Didn't used to be like that when I was younger, but there we go, it is now. But mostly, the biggest advantage is this means we've got a fun, safe way of getting people into sparring and free play much more easily, it's much more accessible than we ever could do before. And to be honest, even compared to the Dusaks or the other kind of boffers available, these are, in my opinion, way better. I think they look better, they handle better, the hilts are the right shape and the right size, they move right, they bind pretty well, they're durable, they're safe. I absolutely love them. So, FakeSteel Armory, this sounds like a massive kind of, this isn't paid advertising in any way, apart from the fact that they sent me some stuff. This isn't paid or sponsored or anything like that. I genuinely, really freaking love these and highly recommend them. And I hope that you, if you get any, enjoy them as much as we do in my club. And it's not just me, all of my club have been having a lot of fun with these. Obviously there's some types of weapons that you couldn't really make, you probably couldn't make rapiers, for example. There are some weapons, small swords, you couldn't make very thin blades, but for these larger sorts of blades, they really work very well. Anyway, I hope this has been a useful review. I hope you check these out. I hope if you get any, you have immense fun with them and they serve you well. Thanks a lot for watching, and thanks obviously to FakeSteel for sending me these. Cheers, folks.